Ladies and gentlemen, if I may take your attention now, we're just a little bit after 6 o'clock, but I think that's all right on your last lecture to be running a little bit fashionably late, but we will make a start. As with all of these lectures, we don't have any anticipated fire drills, so if it goes off, it's probably to be taken seriously, so we should all exit the hall in an orderly fashion, back through the building as you came in, out through the quad and then round to the King's Lawn. Please don't congregate inside the King's Quad for obvious reasons. If this is blocked, then please do use your fire exits to either side of me here. And that will end my air hostess part of the proceedings. So good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this final event in our 2024 Gifford Lectures at the University of Aberdeen. My name is Joanne Anderson, and I'm a reader in art history and a member of the Gifford Committee. And it's a particular pleasure for me also, as a late medieval art historian and specialising in art and religion, to be having Professor Rubin here. It's been just an absolute joy. And it is really a pleasure for me to introduce for the final time Professor Miri Rubin, who is Professor of Medieval and Early Modern History at Queen Mary's University in London. Those of you who have been attending events here in this room and in King's College Chapel and down at the Art Gallery this Saturday, have been treated to really just such a wonderful and wide-ranging interdisciplinary approach to the topic. And I have to say, for anybody who hasn't come along to these ones, well, you slightly missed out. So I'm sorry about that. But the great news for you is that the beautiful concert in King's College Chapel was recorded and it will be made available. So please do watch out for that, because it really was a tremendous event, and we're so grateful for everyone, also down at the Aberdeen Art Gallery, for putting on such tremendous proceedings. But as I say, it's a wonderful opportunity for me to be, and pleasure for me to be introducing Miri, and we all know her by now as a wonderful speaker and an easy conversationalist up here on the podium and out in the many social and academic occasions that we've enjoyed over the course of the 6 weeks. So really, without any further ado, I would like to welcome you to take the podium and to give your sixth lecture, Beyond the Feminine.
Thank you. So, this hour together marks the end of our Gifford experience, a pilgrimage of sorts, I think, that has taken us to venues across Aberdeen, as well as to distant places and times. I'm really grateful to Dr. Joanne Anderson, who conceived with me the most recent event that we had, which was last Saturday, and I know several of you were there at the Aberdeen Art Gallery. It was a particular pleasure also, I think, for us to work closely with Griffin Coe, the curator. He couldn't be there on the day, but all the prep and all the encouragement was simply impeccable. He knows the collection so very well. So the Gifford experience has also inspired a lot of conversations, and I have to confess, all bar one, in Café Kilau. And I hope you know who took me to the library cafe. And I hope these will bear fruitful and continuing relations. I really, really mean that. I hope many of us will stay in touch. And I particularly want to say to PhD students who maybe something, that I said or that we did here piqued their imagination, or maybe wasn't very clear or not totally clear, please do not hesitate to write to me. I mean that quite honestly, and it'll be fun to think that we can remain in touch. So last Monday, though, the last lecture, we ended with this image. It concluded the lecture about allegory. During that lecture, we considered the prevalent use of feminine figures as allegories, and followed an example of a pair of such figures that had developed out of the exegesis on the Song of Songs. And that pair is church and synagogue. We traced the way that this pair became visualized and expressed in a variety of media, in word and sound and image. The pair conveyed the important truth that Christianity and Judaism were like sisters of sorts, while Ecclesia was triumphant, church was triumphant, synagogue was less so. dejected, defeated, and eventually blindfolded. This view fitted with a sort of Augustinian sense of Christian history, by which the Jews had a role to play in an apocalyptic future. Hence, they were not to be destroyed. There were lots of other reasons why they should not be destroyed. And in the future, then, synagogue's blinding veil would be removed, and she will be made able to see Christian truth. We also noted that after centuries of elaboration in all these media that I mentioned, this symmetrical pair of sisters, as it were, came under pressure to change. After 1350, we no longer find commissions of that contain the pair in that particular way, in that traditional sisterly mode. We must assume that the change was caused by a shift in sensibility that led patrons and the artists they commissioned to understand the relationship between Judaism and Christianity in new and different ways. In these centuries, that also saw many expulsions and increased marginalization of Europe's Jews, the preferred manner of representing church and synagogue became that of radical difference rather than sisterly similarity. In the 13th century poem that we read here at some length, the Disputoison, we saw synagogue as old and ugly and church as young and pretty. In the late 14th century drama of the Presentation of Mary at the Temple, synagogue was dressed in a long, torn, dark mantle and was thrown off the stage to the delight of the audience. By the early 15th century, synagogue's sex was changed. Sex was changed. I'm going backwards. That's what I'm doing. Okay, sorry. Phew. Synagogues, this early 15th century, Westphalian panel here. Synagogue's sex was changed, as you see, as she became a recumbent old man, as different as possible from the young woman of tradition. A century later, yes, I got that right, a man, church was represented by a man, by a priest, and synagogue was a woman ensnared in a snake, a figure much like that of the diabolical witch that was developing at the time across Europe. Looking closely at that transformation, we note the affordance of the allegorical feminine, which served so well for so long, was disrupted by a rising attitude, a changing attitude to the relations between Judaism and Christianity. So the feminine allegory, itself the interpretation of an underlying literal meaning from Scripture, was refigured and underwent that change. Before we turn to today's topic, let us attend a little longer to the historical method we have used throughout these lectures. I've attempted throughout to situate each source. I used everything that I used, like an image or indeed the music in the chapel. I tried to situate each of them within the environment of their production, attending to the maker, to the date, place, genre, institution that supported their making, and so I treated them historically. At the same time, each text, artifact, or image was also shown to be a unique expression of that vast religious field we may treat much more broadly as Christianity. If Christianity is a language that can be used to speak about every aspect of life, then each utterance that uses that language may be thought of as being Christian. Every utterance in word or matter hence forms part of an archive of sorts of all the possibilities contained within Christian cultures. Here, in presenting that idea to you, I'm inspired by a book from 2016 by Shahab Ahmed, What is Islam? Ahmed sought to conceptualize a sense of the Islamic which could accommodate not just the Islamic life in North Africa and around the Mediterranean and West Asian versions, those versions that are associated with being Arab, and which are the most commonly discussed by scholars and indeed by the media. He rather wanted to think of a system that would connect all those expressions of Islam also with what he calls the Islam from the Balkans to Bengal and beyond. He assembles what he calls an archive, one that gathers in the historical field of utterances and practices, all done in the name of Islam. He seeks to identify something peculiar and particular in Islamic deliberation that renders it Islamic. Moreover, he suggests that Islam is not an essence, but a process. What renders that multivocal process as Islamic, he asks, and he seeks to answer by attending to a variety of structures and modes and media of truth-making and meaning-making, like truth-making and meaning-making, say, through the feminine, which is what we attended to here. Ahmed's was a bold venture, and for an historian, a very attractive one, for it allows space for variety and change and toleration, as well as for conflict between religious cultures and within religious cultures. That is what I've tried to convey in these Gifford lectures. I also think that it fits with the spirit of Lord Gifford and his lectures, that is, to see religion as lived, understood, interpreted, and performed. The word performance brings us to another area of theory and scholarly practice that underpins this final lecture. We have already discussed the necessity of the feminine to Christianity in the first lecture. We've also traced the qualities of nurture and presence of the female body in the many ways that the Virgin Mary was experienced and represented, and that was mostly in the second lecture. Yet so much of the recent scholarship about gender and identity leads us to appreciate actually the instability of gendered identities, to acknowledge how people relate to gendered representations and roles by questioning the binary distinction between male and female. An important intervention in this field occurred 34 years ago with the publication of this here book, Gender Trouble, by past Glasgow Gifford lecturer Judith Butler. As I've already mentioned, that book still has a freshness about it. It remains an invitation to explore what happens when we question the naturalness of male and female as separate, binary, complementary, and in that sense, necessary categories. There are many reasons to do so, and the last decade has witnessed a greater openness in asking these questions than existed, in fact, when her book was published. Gender Trouble challenges the system of knowledge that recognizes only male and female genders and heterosexuality as normative experience of sexuality, with anything outside them considered as aberration, as illness, or as danger. The great anthropologist Mary Douglas explained such binary thinking in general decades earlier in her own Purity and Danger of 1966. She writes, ideas about separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing transgressions have as their main function to impose system on an inherently untidy experience. It is only by exaggerating the differences between within and without, above and below, male and female, with and against, that a semblance of order is created. When we recognize the ways genders are created and pay attention to how the messiness of identification manifests itself in our sources from the past, a richer sense of lives and identities emerges from them and proceeds possibly into the future. So let us see how. The ancients bequeathed to Christians who followed them a system of humoral medicine that continued to inform medieval and early modern understandings, and actually it informs a lot of systems of medical understanding outside Europe and beyond it. This system treated the human body, as it did all living things, as products of the combination of humors that were sanguine, choleric, melancholic, or phlegmatic. Heat and dryness, wetness and cold combined in this manner to create a whole array of human possibilities. The ideal was the male, dry and hot, and its opposite was the female, cold and wet. Yet many combinations existed in between, and these combinations, complexions, could be affected by diet and sleep, by climate, and by physical activities. These conceptual tools allowed every possible mixture of characteristics to be recognized and even understood: bearded women or hairless men. Social practices sought to produce the ideal type, that is, to grow people and nurture people who would adhere to the ideal of male and female. I've learned a great deal about all these matters, I should say, and it's a pleasure to say so, from supervising the PhD of Caitlin Williams at Queen Mary, who is very close now to submitting her study of domestic medicine and care for the body in late medieval England. Discussing bodies in this way led to judgments of character and capacity too, about the difference between men and women, but also about other perceived ethnic or religious groups. So, for example, the renowned medical scholar, physician of Montpellier, Bernard of Gourdon, opined in his much read, very popular and much translated Lilium Medicinae, the Lily of Medicine, and he writes, "Jews suffer an immoderate flow of blood from hemorrhoids for 3 reasons. Generally, because they are in idleness, and for that reason the melancholic superfluities are gathered down. Second, they are generally in fear and anxiety, and for this reason melancholic blood is increased, according to the saying of Hippocrates, fear and timidity, if they have a lot of time to work, generate melancholic humor. Third, this occurs as divine punishment." This anal flow of blood in the Jews is not only a slur, which makes their bodies less attractive, seem more bestial, but it also feminizes them. And here I want to mention, again, the products of research of a very brilliant PhD student that I also had the pleasure of supervising, Kirsten Meyerhofer from the University of Vienna, who's now written authoritatively about this. And the claim here is that Jews were not manly, even that they menstruated. And while the medical texts like this one merely describe this flow of blood, the more devotional or theological texts that discussed it amplified enormously the moral meaning of this affliction suffered, as it were, by the Jews. So it shows how gender could be made to operate just as race does, and indeed in a process akin to racialization, to setting apart and making unattractive, even disgusting, a group of people. So think about it. What is racialization, after all? And so I'm suggesting that feminization is like a form of racialization. It is a process whereby a certain trait, a skin color, ethnicity, is made to stand for the person's whole being, that it essentializes that person. It makes the trait justify a whole series of discrepancies in power or civic rights, access to resources, and so on. To feminize was to marginalize, yet at the same time, it was rare for women to be masculinized. It mostly works in that particular way, the marginalization through making feminine, for obvious reasons. It is very rare indeed to have descriptions of women dressed up as men or accused of being really manly, although of course we have the very famous case of Joan of Arc, who attempted to buoy and encourage the failing French forces to battle in the course of the 100 Years' War. The medical understandings of the body, which permeated all areas of knowledge and used, in fact, the very same conceptual philosophical terms as did theology, philosophy, and the law, allowed for feminization. Feminization was a form of marginalization, and I suggest akin to racialization. But even more interesting and perhaps consequential is the possibility of acting feminine, of performing femininity by choice. So I return here to performance. Performed acts can create realities. After all, we vow, we promise, we bet, we send people into battle with a word, we condemn them to prison or worse, to death. Words matter, and words draw force from being associated with action, gesture, ritual. Words as acts, of course, has been explored by my colleague at Queen Mary, Quentin Skinner, who explained it in particular when he refers to political language. All this follows also, of course, from the seminal work of philosopher J.L. Austin's analysis of speech acts as in all their varieties and their dispositions. Judith Butler, who used some of that work, went further to argue that iterative, daily, sustained behavior as if, acting as if, creates realities. Hence, performances of gender that transgress expected roles produce identity out of that experience. Speech is such a performative act, so let us move to the use of transgressive gendered language beyond the binary. We owe to the American scholar Caroline Bynum a lovely essay written almost half a century ago, and it's called Jesus as Mother and Abbot as Mother, and it's included in this here volume of her articles. She shows how pervasive were, from the 12th century, instances when male religious writers and leaders used the voice of a woman named Jesus as mother, or the abbot as mother, or indeed Paul as mother. For example, an influential monastic leader and theologian, Anselm of Bec, later Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote in his philosophically inclined discussion of God's existence and its attributes, the Monologion of 1077, that God should not be considered as a mother because male is superior to female, and fathers contribute more to the making of the fetus than mothers do. So do not think of God through female attributes. And yet, in a quite different mood, in a devotional mood, that is, at his prayers, he turned to Jesus as mother. But you, Jesus, good Lord, are you not also a mother? Are you not that mother who, like a hen, collects her chickens under her wings? Truly, Master, you are a mother. For what others have conceived and given birth to, they have received from you. It is then you, above all, Lord God, who are mother. It was fruitful to think at that moment of Jesus as a hen, prompted, of course, by Luke 13:34's literal sense, but here developing its maternal sense of giving life and caring for her chicks, and it goes deeper. And I suggest we should think of such pronouncements, be they in writing, in preaching, in prayer, not only as metaphor, but as performance of sorts, even just for a short while, performance of that female sense. Performance not in the dramatic sense of make-believe or pretend, but as incorporation into the iterated routines of life, a quality not normally assigned to one, and so transforming what that quality is, as well as one's own identity by doing so. Let us see how this works, or how this can work, in more overtly embodied fashions. So we return here to Bernard of Clairvaux, that really complex worker with the feminine. In his sermons on the Song of Songs of the 1130s, Bernard engaged with verse 1-2, "Your breasts are better than wine." And remember, these are sermons for his brothers at Clairvaux, delivered in the chapter house. When she said then, the beloved, "Your breasts are better than wine," she meant the richness of the grace that flows from your breasts contributes far more to my spiritual progress than the biting reprimands of superiors. Not only are they better than wine, but smelling sweet, of the best ointments too, for not merely do you refresh those presents with the milk of inward sweetness, you also spray the pleasing perfume of good repute over the absent ones, and so are well thought of both by outsiders and by those within. So whose breasts are these? These are the breasts of the male beloved, whom Bernard treats throughout as Christ himself. Christ's breasts are a source of grace, but also of wonderful smells. Remember, perfume of good repute, that draws people to him, outsiders and those within. Here are milk and ointments, the materials of nurture and of bodily care associated with the domestic sphere and with women's work and roles. They are chosen by Bernard over so many other available attributes of a normative male body, of Christ-gendered male in the world. What Bernard is doing here is what scholars and commentators call queering. The word queer has been since around 1900 used as a slur against homosexual men and men perceived as being effeminate, alongside its meanings, which are still common to us, odd or strange or unseemly or disturbed or disturbing. From the 1980s and 1990s, it became increasingly appropriated by gay activists, famously by the group Queer Nation, in the struggle to protect gay people against violence. Nowadays, it often means any sexual orientation that is not straight. It is an appropriation aimed at disabling an abusive term, like many other terms that undergo that process. Queer is also being developed by academics for their analysis of texts, and soon of images and music too. Queering in this sense is not just about sexual orientation, but it describes the intellectual work that goes to identify, acknowledge, and understand what Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick has described as the mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning when the constituent elements of anyone's gender, of anyone's sexuality, aren't made or can't be made to signify monolithically. An interesting recent book by Roland Betancourt, Byzantine Intersectionality, explores exactly this type of fluidity that cannot signify monolithically. He studies, in particular, Byzantine hagiographical writings, rules for monks, sermons that enhance the religious life. There is repeated reference in these texts, he finds, repeated reference to the temptation posed by young men, by boys, with their feminine faces. For example, a 5th century Palestinian monastic leader, Euphemios, requested that his monks take care not to let your youngest brother come near my cell, for because of the warfare of the enemy being the devil, it is not right for a feminine face to be found in the lavra. And just to remind you that the lavra, these are really sort of like the forms of early Christian monastic organization, living in clusters of cells or caves, whereby each monk or hermit lived mostly on his own. But there was also a certain coming and going between the members. These were the least regulated of monastic programs, hence the danger of the devil, the enemy, besetting the solitary monk. But what was that danger here? That a young man might appear so feminine as to entice a man beset by the devil? Is this man-to-man attraction? Is this man-to-woman? Could any beardless man experience or be experienced as a woman? I bring these questions here before returning to Bernard so as to prompt our thinking about the feminine, its affordances, what the feminine allowed Bernard to say, and also to wonder whether there was a playfulness in his usages too. So let us move back to Bernard and do so through his Sermon 9 on the Song of Songs. While the bride is conversing about the bridegroom, he, as I've said, suddenly appears, yields to her desire by giving her a kiss, and so brings to fulfillment those words of the song, "You have granted him his heart's desire, not denied him what his lips entreated." The filling up of her breasts is a proof of this, for so great is the potency of the holy kiss that no sooner had the bride received it than she conceives, and her breasts grow rounded, and the fruitfulness of conception bearing witness, as it were, with this milky abundance. The bride responds to the lover's kiss with a bodily reaction. She feels it in her breasts because he has caused her to conceive with that kiss. Women indeed feel that hormonal rush in their breasts during pregnancy, when their breasts grow and swell. But there is more. In the next section, as Bernard develops what truly interests him, that is the spirituality of his monks, his audience, he says, "Men with an urge to frequent prayer will have experience of what I say. Often enough, when we approach the altar to pray, our hearts are dry and lukewarm. But if we persevere, there comes an unexpected infusion of grace. Our breast expands, as it were, and our interior is filled with an overflowing love. And if somebody should press upon it then, this milk of sweet fecundity would gush forth in streaming richness. Let us hear the bridegroom. You have received, my love, what you asked from me. And here is a sign to show you your breasts are better than wine. Henceforth you will know that you have received the kiss because you will be conscious of having conceived. That explains the expansion of your breasts, filled with a milky richness, far surpassing the wine of worldly knowledge. Standing at the altar, leading prayer, celebrating the Mass, offering communion with the sense of full and gushing breasts, a body aware of its own fullness, of its milky richness. Here Bernard speaks to his monks, his intimates, those in his care at Clairvaux, as a group of pregnant women. This fascination with the breast, the turn to the breast as the image that allows the expression of nurture and grace and blessing, did not end there. 3 centuries after Bernard's death, a new narrative began circulating in 15th century Europe. It was based on a story about Bernard that was not included in his vitae, in the hagiographical accounts of his life that were composed by those who knew him best and very, very close to the time of his life and death. Rather, this new narrative is known to us from a collection of Mary miracles in Old Norse from the 13th century, as discovered and discussed by Brian Patrick Maguire, whom I should say happens to be the supervisor, the Dr. Fata of Frederick Peterson, known to you all. Bernard had caused his community to think a great deal about the Virgin Mary in his very influential homilies, and he praised the breast in his commentary on the Song of Songs, as we have seen. So it seemed apt, clearly, to some of his followers to imagine Bernard in a privileged relationship with the perfect, purest breast, that of Mary, Mary's own. Hence, there develops by the 15th century the idea, the concept, the story about the very privileged lactation of Saint Bernard, you see an early example there, as an act of maternal assertion, maternal giving, the mother gone wild in a way as she squirts milk on her favorite Bernard. This representation spread in two trajectories. One was Iberian, like that rather wonderful Portuguese one, and one Flemish. Two trajectories, two areas of Europe where this particularly developed. There is a reversal here, for Bernard is cast as a child of sorts, receiving the breast milk. His face is invariably pale and smooth, his demeanor humble, and his white Cistercian habit is not unlike the swaddling cloth of a child. Bernard as Mary's child. See another instance of this aesthetic in a devotional diptych from the early 16th century from the Diocese of Utrecht. The diptych was commissioned by one William Bibot around 1530, a Carthusian leader. Look at his smooth baby face, tending towards Mary, so much like, I mean, his own, obviously, habit, looking so much like the clothes, the white cloth that is enveloping Christ the child. Think of the consequences of a sustained, repeated, performed infantile masculinity in the making of religious men with their ever beardless faces, their tonsures, never creating their own families. So this sustained relationship to the feminine may queer a man in the sense of also infantilizing him in a manner that makes him vulnerable, without authority sometimes, and perhaps without a voice. What is a voice, in fact? What is a masculine voice? What is a feminine voice, for that matter? A famous anecdote recounts Charles Dickens. There is a reason for mentioning him here. Just stay with me. There's a famous anecdote about Charles Dickens writing to William Blackwood, who was the publisher who published George Eliot's Scenes of a Clerical Life in several installments in his magazine in 1857. So Dickens writes to him saying, "I should have been strongly disposed, if I had been left to my own devices, to address the said writer as a woman." It's George Eliot, right? As a woman. "I have observed what seems to me such womanly touches in those moving fictions that the assurance of the title page is insufficient to satisfy me even now." We think we can tell apart a female from a male voice, but can we? Could those in the past do it better? The ascription of gender to writings reflects a whole set of pre-modern expectations regarding education and access to literacy, to genre, to social roles, and gendered expectations regarding knowledge and feelings. But as we have seen so far, some of these boundaries could be crossed, transgressed, queered. So let us move for a little while to the north of France in the 1290s, when we first hear of a female mystic, Marguerite Porete, who had written a dangerous little book. For the errors contained in her book, Marguerite was brought in front of the Bishop of Valenciennes in the late 1290s, and he ordered that the book be burnt and that she be reprimanded and told never to circulate, or never again to circulate, this dangerous heretical work. Marguerite persisted in the promotion of her ideas, no doubt encouraged by the fact that really three educated churchmen, a theologian from the University of Paris, a Franciscan, and a cantor from the Abbey of Villers, had all quite a high regard of that same book. The Mirror of Simple Souls is its title. These men, with different outlooks on the religious life and experiences of it, had found the book that had been burnt in Valenciennes just a few years earlier to be rather interesting, praiseworthy, though they admitted a bit dangerous in the wrong hands. Marguerite continued to circulate it, and that led within a decade to her arrest again in Valenciennes an attempted interrogation, and then the passing of her on in 1308 to Paris to the hands of the country's France's lead inquisitor, the Dominican William of Paris, who was also the confessor to King Philip IV. On the 1st of June, 1310, Marguerite was burnt at the Place de Grève, where many testified to her noble and inspiring bearing and her piety even as she was being executed. The Mirror of Simple Souls conveys a brilliant vision of a soul so annihilated by the love of God that this soul became liberated from all the forces that bound other souls to earthly rules. That soul was free from the sacraments and virtues, from the teachings of preachers and friars, from institutions and their strictures. So immersed is that soul in God that she can only obey him, since she is at one with him. Of these souls, says love, it's built as a sort of dialogue between love and reason. Of these souls, says love, we will take one for all to speak the more readily. This soul desires not despite or poverty, nor tribulation, nor disease, nor masses, nor sermons, nor fastings, nor orisons, and she gives to nature all that she wants without grudging. Written in a variety of patterns of verse and prose, in a lively vernacular typical of that part of northern France that borders with Flanders, here is a seductive vision of what an intense religious life could be. One can also see why the inquisitors absolutely detested the book. And yet, the book outlived its author. It did so in a tradition of French manuscripts. Excerpts from the work circulated and were used by a Celestine monk in the Auvergne to teach the boundaries of mystical meditation in the 14th century. It was also translated into Middle English and was used in the libraries of the houses of the Carthusian order in England, including the London Charterhouse. Some of the commentaries on the text were entered in the margins in English by one M.N., that scholars have identified as Matilda Newton from Sion Abbey. And the Middle English was then translated into Latin in 1491 by Richard Methley of Mount Grace in Yorkshire. The book in these late medieval translations was nowhere attributed to a woman or treated as heretical, though one commentator did admit in a marginal note that it does deal with and raise high spiritual feelings. There was yet another strand of transmission in Latin in Italy, where Justine Trombley has identified its treatment, literally line by line, by legal experts as a heretical text that needed to be refuted, but never was it claimed that it was authored by a woman. So after her death, Marguerite's little vernacular book was assimilated as a male-authored book into the rich devotional fabric of French and English religious houses. It was also translated into Latin, twice at least, and was sometimes treated as a dangerous text. Perhaps what we have here is that Marguerite, a woman, had also performed and continued to perform after her death, in a way, a normative male religious and intellectual set of traits. She wrote, she debated, she insisted, she questioned, and she suffered. Would Dickens have recognized her as a woman had he read her? Those of you who have seen the recent film American Fiction, definitely worth seeing, will know just how ideas about authenticity and voice in literary production can lead to the most absurd reductionism and to no little amount of racism, too. So it is time to draw our efforts together. In the earlier lectures and events, I attempted to show why the feminine was necessary to those who reflected on, enacted, debated, and made material, visual, and sonic the religion of incarnation. The body of the Mother of God was imagined as pure and forever virginal, yet it was also human, maternal. We saw that the breast and the womb were celebrated but also that they became sources of embarrassment and grounds for polemic. Situating the Mother of God within her family and social networks were expressed at the Feast of the Visitation, as we saw, which we examined in the second lecture. It put women, young and old, in the public domain, embracing, greeting each other, bursting into song. We heard their Magnificat resound in our recital, and we traced the passage of the feast to the lands of conquest and mission, to Mexico, for example, where the idea of a woman traveling the land to visit her relative, as Mary had done, offered an occasion for preachers to warn against young women's freedom to move to markets and in streets. The feminine was thus omnipresent, yet hard to control. It was a set of opportunities to create, imagine, but also to deplore. The feminine also attracted allegorical preoccupations, as we have seen. The feminine offered less resistance, perhaps, to the projection of abstract ideas upon it, for it was understood as having less substance and authority. Within the commentary tradition, we witnessed the emergence of an allegorical pair of feminine figures into which were poured church and synagogue, Christianity and Judaism. We saw the sisterly setting offer an image of kinship between the two that persisted for some time before its collapse in the face of political and religious pressures that drained it of its credibility. The feminine gave way to the masculine, church became a priest, and nubile synagoga, an old man. All this leads us to say that the affordances of the feminine, that which the feminine enables, were well established in these cultures, affordances that were always situated within fields of power and authority that allow or discipline, fund or discourage certain uses rather than others. The breadth of associations with the feminine that we have discussed does not mean that just anything or everything could be said or represented through the feminine. Not at all. The language of religion has its logic, its grammar, its dialects, and we have traced some of these in the course of these lectures. All the utterances made with and thanks to the feminine within that religious language can be gathered into a field, just as Shahab Ahmed has suggested, I think, into a lived archive of Christian traditions that are world traditions, global ones, and Scottish ones, as our session at the Art Gallery showed. So the pathways of the feminine in Christian traditions are manifold, but their taught meanings can be undermined, questioned, queered. So attractive was the breast that Bernard of Clairvaux spent a great deal of his creative energies imagining it, having his own, bursting with love and teachings for his fellow monks. This figure of rectitude and authority, Bernard, and amongst many others, these types of figures were further made possibly into a child blessed with Mary's milk. To recognize such variety, to recognize the possibility of those people in the past, imagining and transgressing in this way, and thus, I think fruitfully we use the word queering here, is to acknowledge the ways in which, and here I paraphrase literary scholar Caroline Dinshaw, a past and the present can still find ways to touch. So inhabiting a voice was a choice of sorts. In Sarah Ahmed's words, one we discussed in the first lecture, it was an orientation. I found the idea of orientation to be helpful in preparing these lectures, as it allows us to rethink the determinations of gender. Ahmed suggests that living gender, in fact, involves a great deal of deliberation and choice. How to dress, how to write, how to walk. There is here performance in Butler's sense, but there's much more and more interesting, I think, in Ahmed. Ahmed fully accepts our embodied condition, our situatedness amongst things and landscapes, amongst other humans, and alongside non-humans. We are educated to live certain paths amidst them, but we can also make narratives, create happiness, as one of her essays suggests, that defy, queer, and challenge. We have seen some people in the past do just that with the affordances of the feminine that their Christian cultures made available to them. So I leave you with several questions, and that is what we've really come here to do. In Hannah Arendt's 1972 Gifford Lectures, later published in 2 volumes as The Life of the Mind, she pondered the dividing line between truth and meaning. She used Kant's terms, Verstand, as a sort of scientific inquiry, and Vernunft, a higher order of understanding behind that which is captured by the senses and enters the order of science, which she considered to be something like just mere common sense. Marked by the Second World War, where the use of science and its methods had proven so destructive, she desired to go beyond that. Yet even as I feel that her distinction between science and meaning is way too sharply drawn, I am attracted to Arendt's sense that, while our thirst for knowledge may be unquenchable because of the immensity of the unknown, the activity itself leaves behind a growing treasure of knowledge that can be retained and kept in store. So, I hope, may the treasure of knowledge remain with you, the Gifford audience of 2024, without whom none of this would have been possible or so enjoyable. At the end of the first of his 2 years as a Gifford lecturer, William James, my intellectual companion on this journey, as you know, wrote to his friends, no less, Veni, Vidi, Vici. And the awful lectures are over. But then he was an old and ill man who was taking digitalis just to keep himself going while he delivered the lectures. My experience has been a far more benign one, and yet as deeply felt, I think. On the occasion of James's last lecture in 1902, his brother, the author Henry James, came up from Rye in East Sussex, where he was living, and at its end, the students broke out in a chant for "He's a jolly good fellow." I too am fortunate in having supportive friends here this evening who've come up from Glasgow and from London, and who I'm sure will enjoy meeting all of you later in an informal fashion. But I'm not sure that jolly good fellow is quite appropriate to end what we've tried to attempt here. What is appropriate, though, is for me to convey how stimulating and energizing it has been to meet many of you over these weeks. And if Lord Gifford hoped that the lecturers could be earnest inquirers after truth, I would only just slightly modify that by saying that we have inquired after truths, inasmuch as there have been lots of different lessons in the complexity of embodied humans as they attempted to give shape and meaning to their worlds through religious ideas and practices. The feminine was a powerful creation, and it remains with us, powerful indeed, and to some, very sadly, this is quite terrifying. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miri, for this wonderful lecture, really thought-provoking and so theoretically and historically situated. It's been just an absolutely stunning end to a really beautiful lecture series. Thank you for all the time and care that you have extended to these and to making it so pertinent to, I think, us in Aberdeen, and we really thank you for that. We're going to maybe depart from convention so far of the lectures and invite you, rather than to do questions and answers here in this room, but rather to do these over drinks in the reception, where I think that we can afford to have many great conversations. And I know you're also keen to speak with Miri, that this will be a really lovely way to end things. However, it is also a lovely opportunity for you to step outside and see the lovely book display that Blackwell's from On the High Street have set up. Hopefully you've seen this on your way in. It's a chance to look at books that have been linked to the lecture series that Miri has referenced so many times in so many interesting ways. You'll be able to perhaps purchase there, but also just to browse and have a look and discuss them. So that is just one thanks to Blackwell's for doing this, for putting on that beautiful display in the bookshop, which you very much enjoyed, and for them to come here and for Emily to be manning the stand outside. So alongside this, it is an invitation to you to join us for drinks and discussions afterwards and keep the conversations going. But I also want to be able to give some thanks, and this is on behalf of the Gifford Committee, to give our thanks, probably our combined thanks here, like to the terrific media services who have kept us on the straight and narrow the whole way through, and particularly to Sean Phillips, Chris Surgeoner and Jack Webster, really for their time and care in making sure everything runs very smoothly. Thank you. We give huge thanks to Paula Duncan, our Gifford associate. She's worked tirelessly behind the scenes over months here to get us to where we are and to make everything run so beautifully in terms of the events and the hospitality for Miri. So thank you very much for all your efforts. I would like to thank you, our audience, for coming along throughout the whole series or coming into the lectures that you were able to join and the cultural events. Thank you for supporting us across 6 weeks and in diverse forms. You've been really brilliant in doing that. And really, of course, finally to you, Miri, is the sincere thanks on behalf of the committee for
it's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. It's been just so wonderful to have an interdisciplinary series of lectures on the feminine and the religious imagination, and please join me in thanking her again as our 2024 Gifford Lecturer. Thank you.